Oh, this actually doesn't work, so I don't need this. So I'm Jim Surowiecki. I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker. I write a column there called The Financial Page, and I'm the author of a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which came out about a year and a half ago, which is sort of about, well, I'll talk about what it's about in a minute. So as Peter said, these are sort of reflections on openness. One of the things you'll see is that there are going to be, I think, a lot of intersections between what I talk about and things you've already heard and things you will hear. And my discussion of them will be far more general and probably less useful, but hopefully the broad picture will provide a framework for thinking about what we're talking about at this conference. You know, so I wrote this book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which is roughly speaking about the ability of large groups of people to make remarkably intelligent decisions. So the sort of simple example I use to start the book is, you know, if you ask a group of people, actually this is probably about large enough, to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, the group's average guess will be excellent. It'll be, you know, somewhere between about 5 and 10% of the number of beans in the jar, and it will be better than the vast majority of the people in the room. It'll probably be better than 90 to 95%, and many of the times when I've done it, it's actually better than any one person in the room. Now, guessing how many jelly beans are in a jar is obviously a very simple problem. But what's interesting is that as the problems become much more complex, the ability of groups to solve these problems does not diminish, and actually in some ways probably improves. So the internet is actually a vehicle for where you can see a lot of these things in action. Prediction markets like the Iowa electronic markets, or trade sports, or the Hollywood Stock Exchange, Google, which obviously relies on the inputs of all of sort of the internet as a whole, to be able to decide where the information you're looking for is. And there are a whole host of examples of kind of collective wisdom in action on the internet. But what's interesting is that when I talk about the wisdom of crowds, obviously a lot of people have questions about other ideas, other forms of either collaboration or user-driven innovation, bottom-up mechanisms more generally. And so these would include everything from Linux to Flickr, which is sort of this sort of photo organizing thing on the web, to prediction markets. I mean, there are a whole host of these mechanisms. And what's interesting is that when I think about them, some of them I talk about in my book, and then certainly I've written about a lot of them in other contexts. What's interesting to me is that underneath all of these, although they are very different, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the differences are, there does seem to me to be an affinity between a lot of these different ideas. And I don't know exactly what the right word for that affinity is. I keep sometimes I come back to the word spiritual, which I think is clearly not right, and emotional doesn't seem to capture it either. But I do think that the idea of openness is really the concept that bridges all of these different mechanisms, many of which the internet has become home to. So when I thought about this question that sort of Peter offered me, which is sort of what is this sort of ethos of openness, it seems to me that there are a few principles that we can kind of think about as defining what openness means. One of them is that intelligence is, for the most part, distributed rather than centralized. So that the knowledge we want, the knowledge we need, tends to be spread out among many different people in many different locations, rather than being concentrated necessarily in the hands of a few. The second principle is that bottom-up mechanisms tend to work better than command and control mechanisms, which in some vague sense may mean simply that people are better at understanding what they need and want than the people on the top are. And so that if you can create a situation for self-organizing networks or bottom-up networks or bottom-up organizations to form, you're probably going to end up with better solutions. Along the same lines, you're better off casting your net widely rather than narrow. And that, in part, is because we don't know where the information we're looking for is much of the time. So we don't always know who has the knowledge we want. That's obviously what Eric was talking about with, you know, the user-driven stuff, but I think it's true in general that many times the knowledge, the pieces of knowledge we're looking for are not in the places where we first imagined to look for them. And so that actually the idea of open access to information, open access to creativity, open access to knowledge is not just a political question or a moral question. That is to say, it's obviously better for more people to know in a kind of moral sense, but actually that the benefits to all of us will be greater the more people have access to information. Jefferson sort of famously, it's a quote that we're all familiar with probably, but sort of Jefferson in his argument for why property rights were not very well suited to thinking about information or knowledge, sort of talked about the non-rivalrous nature of knowledge. So he said, no one possesses knowledge the less because other people possess the whole of it. And he said, he who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine. But the really interesting thing, and this is what I think Professor Cooper was talking about, is that it isn't just that other people learn without diminishing our knowledge. It's actually the fact that other people learn increases our knowledge as well. So that information and knowledge are not just non-rivalrous. They are oftentimes, in many situations, anti-rivalrous. And we end up, when I tell someone a piece of information, they often will give me that knowledge back with added value attached. And so the last principle I would say is that we should be very hesitant to filter in advance who does and doesn't belong to the communities or the knowledge groups that we are trying to tap. So you do not want to do a lot of sort of filtering in advance, keeping people out of knowledge communities. Now, I would argue that the tradition of openness is actually a very powerful tradition in the West. You can certainly go back to Aristotle, who talked in his Politics about the benefits of diversity and the value of having many different inputs. He sort of compared the polity to kind of a meal where you want many different inputs. And he actually wrote that there are situations in which each individual may be a worse judge than the experts, but when they meet together, they actually are either better than the experts or at least no worse. And obviously, in the Enlightenment, you sort of see this notion of openness rise to the fore. Kant sort of famously in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, asked people to have the courage to use your own understanding. So that instead of trying to rely simply on the judgment of a very few at the top, you wanted people to be able to act on their own knowledge. And obviously people are going to be better at acting on their own knowledge the more knowledge they have. The rise of the public library system in the West and the United States in particular, I think, was in large part driven by the notion that open access to information would in fact redound to the benefit of all. And then most explicitly, as has already been talked about quite a bit, the scientific community. So I suspect when John Walensky talks, you'll hear a lot more about this. But obviously Henry Oldenburg, who founded the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in the 17th century, the notion that you should have open access to information, that scientists should disclose the results of their experiments and talk freely about them, was obviously central to the rise of the scientific community. And the sociologist Warren Hagstrom sort of has talked about the scientific community from the beginning as a gift economy. Robert K. Merton talked about science as one of the few places where actually you become richer the more information you give away. So that the notion of property in the scientific community is obviously very different from the way it operates in much of the rest of the world. And scientific community, let's call it broadly, applies also to scholarship in a general sense. And I would even argue that in the Scottish Enlightenment, the idea of the free market actually had something to do with openness. That markets were seen as the free market was seen as a way of breaking down very traditional barriers to access and to creativity. And that the market was seen as a way of fostering openness as well. So there is a very powerful tradition of this in the West. On the other hand, there is also a very powerful counter-tradition, which I'll talk about at the end of the talk, which represents a very different idea of what we want private property is and of what knowledge is. But I think that this powerful tradition has obviously received an enormous impetus in the last few years from the rise of sort of the digital economy generally and the internet specifically. And that is because we have become technologically capable of doing so much more, both in terms of distributing knowledge and making knowledge accessible to others, but also in terms of aggregating and collecting knowledge. So that the possibilities for tapping into that distributed information that, at least in theory, has always been out there, are so much greater than they once were. I think Eric may have talked about how much of what we're doing now was heretofore impossible, but it is now, the possibilities are just now immense. But let me talk for a minute about, I think one of the things that's happened is that there are very different ways of tapping into what we could call these open systems, and that there are, as a result, very different open systems, in a sense. And let me just talk about those differences in a couple of ways. One is obviously that there are obviously people who are using open access and open systems of creativity and production to make money. So, Lego is able to use those innovations and in turn produce products that they can actually reap benefits of. There's a company called Innocentive, which some of you may be familiar with. It's actually started by Eli Lilly. And what this company does is it essentially takes problems that companies have a very hard time solving. They're oftentimes simple, not simple, but sort of simple problems that they just don't have the resources or the interest to devote to at the moment. And they basically put them online. They give them to Innocentive, and Innocentive runs a website which you can check out. And then basically anyone in the world can come to Innocentive and register as a solver. Okay, so you can go, and there's no filtering process except you have to register and give them your information, etc. And once you're registered, then you basically have access to this problem set. And you can go and if you're a chemist or whatever it is, you can look at the problems in chemistry. You can go and you can try to solve these problems. And if you solve the problems, you get a prize. So each problem has a prize attached to it. And the more complicated the problem, the more expensive it is. Now, once you solve that problem, if you succeed in doing so, the company actually owns your solution. You get the benefit of it, but of the money, but the company actually owns your solution. So this is one model, not the same as many of the others we're talking about, for how open access, that is to say, these people are working on problems that they would never had access to. They're able to contribute in some sense to the solution of these problems in a way they would never have been able to. But Innocentive and the companies that are giving them the problems are also able to reap enormous profits for it. The flip side of that is obviously just open systems where there is no sort of clear economic profit motive behind it. And these would include everything from the original formation of Linux to obviously what MIT is doing with open Courseware, et cetera. There are potential economic benefits at the back end, but in theory at least, the openness is driven there by a different model. The other distinction I would make that I think is very interesting and important are between open systems that involve trying to find one person who has the right answer and open systems that rely on the aggregation of many different inputs into one sort of collective product. And this is an important distinction. One is not better than the other. The nature of the problem dictates which model you want to use. But I do think that it's important to recognize the difference between the two. So if you think about the user-driven innovation that Eric von Hippel was talking about, in each of those cases, there is one person effectively who is coming up with the innovation. Okay, so you have this core group of lead users. And in each case, there's one person who kind of comes up with the innovation. The goal of sort of casting the net widely, if, say, you're a company that's trying to rely on user-centered innovation, is to maximize the number of people who are offering innovations because that increases your chances of finding the good ones. Okay? You're to finding the individuals who have the good ones. But in all these cases, one person is coming up with them. Similarly, if you think about Linux, one person is always writing whatever the piece of code is that is allowed to make it into the kernel. Okay? So in those cases, you cast the net wide because it maximizes your chance of finding the one person who has the right answer. The other model of open systems, though, is closer to what I call the wisdom of crowds. And these are systems that try to cast the net widely because you're trying to come up with a product that is genuinely, in some sense, collective. So that is what, for instance, prediction markets do, right? You want to aggregate the knowledge of many different people. And the price in a prediction market, which is sort of trying to forecast a given event or the outcome of an election or the box office performance of a movie or whatever it would be, the outcome of that event in some sense represents the collective judgment of everyone who's participating in that market. Google, similarly. Google weights its link structure, but ultimately, Google's PageRank system is ultimately a collective judgment of the internet as a whole. Google isn't trying to find the one person who knows where the information is. It's actually trusting you can cast the net widely enough, you'll end up with a collectively intelligent judgment. Now, these are both very useful models, and they're both very productive models, but they are different ones, I think. And the one twist, I think, that we've seen on the first model, where you're trying to find the one person who has the right answer, is that oftentimes you can use the community itself, the collective judgment of the community itself, to judge the inputs of those individual users, right? So, I don't know, Slashdot, where you allow people to vote on which people are most likely to make intelligent contributions. And there are a variety of ways to do this, but I think that to the extent that you can tap into the collective judgment of people, the results are going to be better. Now, the title of this conference is, at least in theory, the economics of open content. And the question of the economics of this, I think, are tremendously complicated. It is obviously possible to profit from an open access system. Professor Coran talked about earlier a system in which you sort of give the content away and then you're allowed to profit by talking about it. Okay, that's a sort of John Perry Barlow model where you sort of give everything away and then you reap the benefits of performance. Obviously, as I said, a company like Innocentive is figuring out a way to tap into all this open knowledge that's out there and reap benefits from it. Google, similarly, and Red Hat. Companies like Red Hat, which have been able to essentially piggyback on the work of people at Linux and reap the benefits of that. But I think the really interesting question when it comes to economics is whether or not our definition of value and of economics has been, to a certain extent, too narrow. And that what has happened over the last decade or so is that we are starting to see, and maybe this, sometimes I think this is something that was always obvious to most people, but was not obvious to economists, is that people's definition of value and people's willingness to invest their time and energy is much broader than sort of traditional ideas of profit or remuneration. If you think about it, all value in the world is essentially created by the conversion of time or labor into a product or service or something like that. And what I think is increasingly clear is that people are willing to devote their time to products that they essentially reap no obvious monetary value from, because people derive value in many, many different ways. So people derive value from reputational benefits, right? They derive value because they are recognized as creators or as innovators, or they derive value from the simple pleasure of competition. If you look at a lot of these prediction markets, for instance, the Hollywood Stock Exchange or newsfutures.com, all of which I would recommend checking out, these are play money markets. Okay, so you can win prizes if you're at the very top. For the vast majority of users, there is zero economic benefit from it in a monetary value. But people are willing to participate because I think in part they derive pleasure from the value of competition and from outperforming those around them or their friends or whoever it is. I also think in some sense, though, there also probably is something like a desire to contribute. That is to say, people who have knowledge or interests which they are devoted to, they derive value from being able to contribute to the growth of this. We've always accepted this in some sense in the scholarly community, but what I think is becoming evident is that that impulse is much broader and much richer than we had previously imagined it to be. And so people really are interested in just adding their knowledge to sort of the base as a whole. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that many of these systems are, in a strict economic sense, inefficient. They're often inefficient because they're redundant, so you have a lot of people producing solutions that never actually do get picked up. Right? If you think about Linux, you have all these people out there who, at least in theory, are writing code that may never actually get incorporated into the kernel. But I think that the point is that although many of these systems are inefficient in a traditional sense, if we expand our ideas of efficiency, you can see that they are, in fact, tremendously efficient. Because there are all these people out there who are willing and able to labor, essentially for no compensation, and who collectively are able to produce remarkably good results. And collectively, we all reap enormous benefits from that. Now, what I want to talk about in the next few minutes is just a couple of the challenges, I think, that these models confront. And one of the challenges I want to talk about is internal, and then the others are sort of external, and then I'll be done. I do think there is a problem with these models internally, and that is that when you have a networked or a self-organized model, it is sometimes difficult for people to continue to contribute individually because it becomes very easy for networks to become sort of echo chambers. In my book, I talk about the problem of what I call the circular mill. And it's this model that's sort of taken from ants. When army ants basically most of the time army ants get along pretty well. And they're very, very efficient at solving problems, finding solutions, getting food while expending as little energy as possible, etc. But army ants in South America are blind. And when they get lost, they have one solution to their problem. And that is do exactly what the ant in front of them is doing. Okay? And what happens is that very quickly, the ants start to form this giant circle. And they just start walking, because each ant is just doing one. So they just start walking in this giant circle. And basically, they just keep walking in this circle until they basically die of either exhaustion or starvation. And to me, I think the challenge of the Internet, one of the challenges of the Internet, of these communities we're talking about, is that it is very easy for people to spend a lot of time paying attention to what those around them are doing and simply jumping on bandwagons. Human beings are by nature imitative beings. We find very early on that imitation is a very useful way to learn. The Internet provides a mechanism for almost instant feedback. It becomes very easy to see what other people are doing in many of these cases. And as a result, what happens when you do that is that the group loses much of its collective intelligence, because instead of drawing on that distributed intelligence, it actually ends up drawing on the intelligence of just a very few people. The people who sort of were in the beginning. Everyone else then ends up imitating them. So I think that one of the challenges is keeping the ties within these networks relatively loose and keeping these networks continually open. In theory, at least, the net is great for this because it's hard to imagine a more free or more open model. But in practice, I think what we found is that it's very easy for that openness to degenerate into a much more closed system. So I think one of the things to keep our eye on is how do we keep the net, in a sense, as cacophonous and as open to loose ties as possible. But I think, obviously, the deeper challenge to this ethos of openness is that it does represent a profound counter to some of our most deep-seated ideas. And I think those are some of our most deep-seated ideas about value, about where innovation comes from, and I think on a deeper level, some of our most deep-seated ideas about things like authority, knowledge, and expertise. And I think that these are fundamental to determining what's going to happen to sort of the open source economy or the open content economy in the years ahead. Now, people you've heard already have talked quite a bit about this, but I do want to say just a couple things. I do think that this notion that the job of business, for instance, is not just to, in a sense, find a need and fill it. That's what people say, but what they really think is to create a product and then tell people or show people why they really need it is very, very deep-seated. So if you think about the Walkman, right, the origin story of the Walkman, which was, the head of Sony sitting around and saying, this is what we really need is, headphones to be able to be on the subway or in my car and listen to it. And no one else had ever thought of this before. And consumers had never imagined it. And the story is when they asked consumers about it, consumers said, oh, no, that would never work. I would never want that. I've always wanted to see the actual tapes or the transcripts of those conversations because I can't imagine who these consumers were who said that's a terrible idea. But that's, in a sense, the kind of model, the paradigm for what innovation looks like, right? You have this sort of single, brilliant innovator and everyone else just kind of falls in his place. And so this is a real radical challenge to it. Even in the user-driven innovation model, right, where you do have individual users who are coming up with these innovations, the fact that there is not the single genius user is very, very important, right? You need to keep casting that net very widely because you don't know in advance where those knowledges are coming from. But that represents a radical challenge to it. On a deeper level, it represents a radical challenge to companies' ideas of how you generate value and intellectual property. So, the real paradox of the last decade, or let's say the last 15 years, is that even as you have this move toward openness, even as you have the rise of these very new ideas about where value and innovation can come from, you also have a profound backlash against these ideas. And you also have a profound strengthening rather than weakening of things like intellectual property rights. So, we are sort of pushing toward openness in many ways. Many of the people in the business community are pushing more and more strongly toward closedness. You have the rise of business method and software patents, which effectively allow companies in some cases to, in theory at least, seem to, patent the idea of the hamburger. You have a radical expansion of copyright lengths. Mickey Mouse was supposed to enter the public domain in 2003. That basically went by the side. The Sony, a classic case. This is sort of what Von Hippel was talking about earlier. iBo. You have a company. They introduced the robot dog. Someone comes up with a way to write a program to make the robot dog dance, and what does Sony do? Instead of saying, okay, great, that's terrific, this makes the iBo more valuable, et cetera, they say, we're going to sue you. Now, they did eventually back away from it, but obviously their first impulse was to shut down rather than to open up. And finally, if you look at the most recent issue of the Harvard Law Review, it actually just went online. There's a long article by Arthur Miller about how what we now need is common law protection for ideas. That ideas themselves need to be able to be protected in some sense by the common law. Now, I don't want to diminish the complicated nature of these issues, right? The idea of intellectual property rights is a very complicated one. My book was published by Doubleday. I write for The New Yorker, which certainly is interested in protecting its intellectual property, although my columns are available online for free. But these are very complicated. These are very, very complicated questions. But I do think that this tension is one that, is really very much alive. And I do not think that the idea that openness is necessarily going to triumph is a guaranteed one by any stretch of the imagination. The second thing, and the second challenge, though, which is in some ways is even more interesting to me, although I think practically the first one is more important, is that these ideas, the idea of openness really does represent in a fundamental sense a challenge to our ideas about what authority and expertise are. And these ideas are very deep rooted. In fact, I think in some ways they may very well be visceral. That is to say, they almost may be like inherent in the way we think about these things. There's this great experiment that I talk about in my book that these two guys, Richard Larrick and Jack Soll, do, where they basically they have a panel of experts. So you have a panel of 5 experts, and you bring in a layperson who has no expertise in the field that these people know about. And you ask the layperson a complicated question. And you say, to solve this question, you can ask these people anything you want. You have these 5 people, you can ask them anything you want, and you can use their knowledge in whatever way you want them to use it. Okay? You want to use it. And what's fascinating is that although the logical thing to do, of course I would say this having written a book called Wisdom of Crowds, but although the logical thing to do would seem to be to take the knowledge of all of those experts and pool it, right, in some form, whether by averaging or whatever it would be. That is not what the vast majority of people do. What the vast majority of people do instead is they try to pick one of the experts as the expert, the real expert. Now, the lay people have no basis upon which to make this judgment. There is no reason for them to think that they would be good at picking the one person who really knows the answer to the question. But instinctively, that is what they do. And I think that impulse, that desire to look for a single source of authority is very, very powerful. So if you think about the scientific community, the fact that the scientific community has actually had a very hard time moving, not just to sort of open access to journals, but also to the idea of opening out the concept of peer review, right? We know the scientific journal process is by many stretches imperfect. So famous study of a whole host of different journal publications found that 50% of all scientific articles were eventually proven to be wrong in some sense. So we know that the vetting process is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We also know that an open access peer review system would probably, in many ways, enhance the process, and it would be relatively easy to do. But it obviously has taken a very long time for them to do it. Sort of even the philosophical transactions, Henry Oldenburg, which I talked about, when he wrote Newton, trying to get Newton to participate, Newton actually decided, he did contribute his famous work on optics to it, but his justification for doing it was that instead of publishing it in a book, which, as he said, would expose decisions to a prejudiced and censorious multitude, I may with freedom instead apply myself to a judicious and impartial assembly, so that only scientists would be reading it, and therefore the results would be much better than if he exposed it to the prejudiced and censorious multitude. Now, it is obviously true that filtering is necessary, right? We want mechanisms to edit. We want mechanisms to figure out what should I pay attention to, what shouldn't I pay attention to, etc. But what's interesting, I think, is that our assumptions about how that filtering needs to be done are really built on, in many respects, a very traditional command and control, top-down, find the one person who can make these decisions model. And I think that that impulse is very, very strong. I think that that is one of the things that we are really running up against and that we really have to begin to break down in order to get more freely into a truly collaborative open access world. Okay, so those, I think, are the challenges. But I do want to say, and again, as Professor Coran said, it is this sort of complicated thing of, I really want this world to happen, so how do we really get there? I do think that the juxtaposition of the new capabilities that technology is opening up, the tremendous benefits that we are actually already seeing from open models, from collaborative models. I mean, if you look at the products of these things, it's very hard to deny their usefulness. And I think this sort of broad impulse, desire for democratization. I think the possibilities are immense. I just think that it's going to require a lot of work to get there. In closing, I just want to quote from someone who I would not have thought of as a visionary in this field, but it's nonetheless very interesting. This is Tom Bergeron, who is the host of the television show Dancing with the Stars. So I was reading an article about this, just glancing through it, and he was talking about why dance is so appealing. Why do people like the show? Why do they like to look at people dancing? And he said 2 people, but I think that for us it should be many people. Wholeheartedly uniting their skills in order to create something that is greater than either of them is the basis for all human interaction. Now, it may not be the basis for all human interaction, but I do hope it is the basis for more and more human interaction going forward. So, thank you very much.
Invite our last 3 panelists up, presenters up, to take some questions. That'd be great. 4? I don't know how many. I can't count anymore. Right. So we have a microphone that's wireless.
Are there chairs? Yeah, there are 4 chairs. Question? Hi, for Jim. Just your comment about people's fundamental desire to pick the expert.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's kind of hardwired into us primates.
Yeah.
But some of that, and one of the factors that may be inhibiting the move towards openness, is the desire to have someone held accountable, for someone to be responsible for the decisions that are made. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, if that had factored into people's thoughts.
Well, just quickly on both those issues, because I think this is something I've become very, very interested in. And I mean, as I mentioned when I talk about the book, about my book, I oftentimes will do one of these experiments. So with the jelly beans or whatever it is. And what's interesting to me is that I've done this, a ton of times. I wrote the book, blah, blah, blah. Every time I do it, I have this sort of slight twinge of doubt right before it actually happens, where I'm like, this time it's all going to go wrong, basically. Because I do think that there is something about the nature of that kind of decision-making that is well, yeah, maybe not necessarily intuitive. But I also think, and that maybe gets to this hardwired question, but I think the second point is a very important one, and that is that, especially within organizations, which is what I have talked a lot about and written a lot about, I think there really is this impulse to have it's the buck stops here thing, right? You want the one person who is really willing or is required, essentially, to take responsibility for it. And one of the things I'm interested in about this is interesting is even Linux itself, right? I mean, that the ultimate decision about what goes into the kernel is not really made by the Linux community. It's actually made by, originally it was made by Torvalds, and now by this relatively small group of people. So I do think that there is a desire for that. I am the one flip side of it that I am always been fascinated by is the market. Right? I mean, if you think about the stock market effectively makes some of the most consequential, or the bond market together, makes some of the most consequential decisions that affect our lives every day, right? I mean, they effectively make massive decisions about how capital will be allocated, what interest rates will be, blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff. No one person makes any of those decisions, right? That's literally the product of thousands or millions of people interacting, collectively deciding these things. And sometimes when I talk about this, I sometimes say no one seems to have a problem with that, but of course we do have a problem with that. Even that is sort of problematic. But I do think that that suggests that there are possibilities for expanding our idea about what accountability means. I think the real challenge is whether if you expand, with smaller groups it seems relative, you can do it, right? You can say collectively we are choosing this. A board of directors, in theory, collectively decides, and they make the choice about whether to fire a CEO or hire a CEO or whatever. The real challenge is, as a group gets larger, is it still possible to retain some sense of accountability or responsibility? I have the faith that it is, but it does require a kind of conceptual leap that I think is a difficult one in a lot of ways. So.
Let me try a little bit on that, because it really is an interesting question about enduring social institutions, which is what I was talking about. If you look at the Common Pool resource literature, what you identify is different kinds of decisions, right? So you have constitutional decisions about who's in the group. You have collective decisions about which kind of rules will apply. And then you have the operational decisions about the day-to-day operation of the rules, right? And you need all three sets of decisions, especially in large, durable groups. So the solution for a common pool resource of fisheries, where the fishermen are going to keep and women are going to keep on coming and going, and people legitimize the process if they invest in a certain set of rules. So, yeah, there's an ultimate authority, right? And so Torvald's lieutenants said, Torvald couldn't keep up with all the emails. We need some other people to make these decisions. And the people who made the decisions were, it turns out, the folks who were making the kernel changes anyway. And it became a process in which the constitutional and collective choices then were able to organize the operational choices. So so in the simple experiment, you don't and the other thing that's critical about this is that those experiments present people with a one-time choice. But common pool resources and collaboratives are continuous decisions, right? And so it turns out that people behave very differently if they're confronted with a sequence of decisions. If those people were told they would have to come back every day and make that decision over and over again, they would behave very differently. And there's a lot of literature about that, which is, again, I've been told I'm too optimistic, but since human beings have been doing it for thousands of years, there may be a source of optimism there.
I'm Marcia Kinder from USA. And talking about the sort of deep commitment to authority that has to be an expert, I wondered about if one brings up the realm of artistic practice, how you would address this issue. Because, of course, on the one hand, one could talk about something like architecture and something like the movies as collaborative forms of artistic practice. But what happens when you deal with paintings, when you deal with novels on the other side? And I know one could talk about intertextuality and those sorts of things. But I wonder how you would talk about and this switch from auteurism to reception studies. So certainly there's the addressing of these ideas within that realm. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that issue.
Yeah, I didn't write about art in my book deliberately because I think it does raise very complicated questions, and it actually gets to what we were just talking about with, I think that these collective models actually work better in situations where we kind of know that there is a right answer. Not what the right answer is, but that in theory a right answer exists, and it may be harder to do that artistically. I think actually art probably is closer to what what Professor Von Hippel's talking about in terms of that lead user generation kind of thing. But although I certainly think that there is something to the notion of users helping to create text, and obviously there's something to the collective product of schools of painting and things like that. I mean, ultimately, I do think that's much closer to a sort of lead user model than to a collective model. The one thing I would say from the open access point of view question in terms of art, which I think most people would agree with, is just that one of the real dangers of our imagining of authority or of individual genius is the notion that works of art are created essentially out of whole cloth, and our failure to see the degree to which works of art really do depend on other works of art, and sort of recontextualizing or reimagining existing texts or existing works of art. This, again, very complicated questions, but the Danger Mouse being a classic example of Danger Mouse's remixing of the Black Album with the White Album. I mean, that really is, to me, a new work of art in any meaningful sense. But it's clearly a work of art that could not have existed had those other works also existed in advance. So, I don't know.
Thank you. I work in the world of advertising with big clients and big media, and I can tell you they are freaked out by this. So in your experience, can you talk about how you've reached across the table and what's been successful in talking to people who are lawyers and owners of a lot of content to help them understand and what resonates with them? So where's the common ground for us? Professor Von Hippel, could you start?
Sure. I really don't think that the large owners of present property are going to give it up. Nobility of soul will not strike them some morning. Instead, I think what's happening is that we're developing a parallel free commons, which creates alternative choices. And so you see that now it's not that Microsoft gave anything up, but rather that Linux has come on as an alternative. And I think this is sort of the process, and it's going to be done, as Larry Lessig says, and I'm sure as you say as well, against the fighting of those who are presently in possession.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick one. In some conversations with some publishers, when we talk about the fact that 97% of their stuff is actually not being sold for anything, could we imagine striking a deal where you'll make it a lot easier for us to show your stuff, and if it happens to get popular again, we'll be fine with you making some money off of it? So what that model looks like, I don't know, but I do think it's an entering wedge for getting around some of the problem you're talking about, although sadly, by no means all of it.
Yeah, alternative distribution is, I think, where the solution lies, in the sense that, and one of the example I have studied at great detail is peer-to-peer distribution of music, which is, as I said, one of the areas that lacks political leadership. The fascinating thing is that the number of, let me put it this way, the number of singles legally sold last year by the industry exceeded the total number of singles they sold in the previous 20 years combined. They hated singles. They didn't want to do it, right? They did use all kinds of evil means to banish the singles. And I like to think there was a rebellion and a lot of self-help from consumers. And now they have rediscovered a singles model, which they absolutely have to embrace. It's been an ugly process, and the lawyers get very upset when I describe this as a civil disobedience or self-help. But the simple fact of the matter is that the alternatives that are out there will eventually discipline those folks. As I said, they will use the force of the state to try and quiet and quell the alternative, but I think they will fail. And that the ones who sooner recognize, as Professor von Hippel has convinced MIT, that the mix of models is actually going to be a better place to live, rather than just saying no, the better off they are.
I'm Isabel Walcott. Could you address sabotage? Because in addition to malicious code and that kind of thing that could be programmed into open source code, you have, for example, newspapers that have tried this whole blogging experiment and then they had to shut it down because of nasty comments. And then the response to them from the open source community, or one of the responses I read was, oh, that only happened to you because you're a big traditional media company. You know, nobody's that mean in real life to the rest of us. So, but that to me, that's not an adequate response. So how can you know, one bad apple spoils the whole barrel or something? Can you address that?
Again, if you go back to the Common Pool resource literature, a consensus develops among the people who draw most closely from the resource. And the rules that develop are you don't go nuclear. You come to share. Now, if it is true that one bad apple can ruin the whole barrel, then we have a real problem because there are going to be bad apples. But in most of these collaborative production regimes, that is not the case. That is, there's no reason to believe that one bad apple is going to destroy them. That doesn't mean that you spend a tremendous amount of time working out governance rules. And the history of open source clearly showed they needed governance rules. They're not open in the sense of unruly. They're now well organized and well disciplined around rules. But if it is true, and there are some people who believe that one bad apple can ruin the whole barrel, then we're in serious trouble. But I don't think that's the case yet. Clearly, though, the answer has to be, yes, that's a flaw in our governance rules. How did that bad apple get in here? They didn't deserve the authority to occupy that position to make that contribution. There is nothing wrong with that. Fishermen have been doing it forever. If you are not part of the community or you brought the wrong technology in, which hurt everybody else, they sanctioned you. This is not an unruly world. It's just a different set of rules.
I mean, in that sense, I do think there is something to the, you're a big and powerful media. I mean, only in the sense of, if you think about Wikipedia, I mean, Wikipedia deals with this kind of stuff, sabotage all the time, right? I mean, people taking down the George Bush page and they actually have had to lock down a few pages. I mean, I think Islam and maybe abortion are locked down. But the difference with Wikipedia is that you do have this kind of self-organized community of people who are basically gardeners, who go back and fix it. And the Washington Post, which obviously is the one, for instance, that just had to shut down or chose to shut down its the Deborah Howell blog. There are no gardeners there. I mean, they have to do that filtering themselves. But I also think that there are just different models. I mean, there are plenty of bloggers who don't accept comments, and some of the most successful and most powerful bloggers in the blogosphere don't accept comments. So it's not necessary for that to be a part of it. So, but I think that this question of the messiness of the process is is one of the biggest differences from a more traditional media model. And I think it's very hard for traditional people who have grown up in a different model to accept that. I think that's true.
Just one micro comment, which is we're in the learning phase here.
Yeah.
So Jimmy Wales, is tweaking this thing all the time. It's so exciting and so new, and it fails in a particular way, and you try to fix it. And this will evolve. We'll understand better how to prevent apples from spoiling barrels.
Yeah. So this is a question to get asked earlier, and it's just an idea, then you can respond to it, and that is that some of the commercial vendors, at least in the software world, have, I think, discovered a new reason to warm to the commons. And, for example, IBM and some other major software vendors are proposing a software patent commons. And although they talk about it in altruistic terms, we want to help health and education and so forth, I think the underlying reason there is they fear mutually assured legal destruction.
Right. Yeah. But in addition, what's happening is they understand that the users or those other people are a complement to them. And so they want to give them freedom to operate in order that they themselves have a healthy complementary market. So yeah, it's good.
There's quality. I mean, there's a quality issue here, right? The mechanism for problems that are that complicated, of having lots of smart people looking at what each other are doing, that's a really good mechanism, and it's very hard to hire all the smart people.
Private appropriation of a common resource has been the essence of all those regimes. So it's a question of working out the rules about who's allowed to take out and what sort of contributions have to be made in. So one of the advances would be, in this patent commons, you can't take out if you don't put in, right? And then if you put in, you can develop the ancillary services without destroying the common pool. Again, these are things that exist, but absolutely, we're at the beginning of a new mode of production, to get back to
I'm Mary Hodder. I actually am launching this week in closed beta a video remix community called Dabble. It's at dabble.com. One thing that I'm noticing as I watch users creating stuff and actually completely eclipsing, in some cases, legacy media is that they're entertaining themselves. And in that process, they've totally changed the mode of production. So traditional production, the way that I see it, is very planned, right? It's a movie set, it takes months, it's storyboarded out, and users that I see are creating things in sort of a discovery production, right? They take a lot of footage, or they do things, and they completely flip the model, and I think it totally changes the output. And I'm kind of curious what you all think about that, and if you're seeing that, and maybe other examples of that you know of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just an initial response. First of all, it's so fun, isn't it? It's just so wonderful. I mean, but that's not an answer. But it relates to the point that James was making earlier, which is really what we see as wasteful redundancy in this model is not necessarily. People are developing this stuff for themselves. They're enjoying the process. They're learning from the process. That's something that and they're using the output. And so it's not a waste in that same sense that one might argue. But yeah, I see it, and you know, people who innovate for themselves only have to entertain themselves. People who are innovating and will not benefit unless they sell it to somebody else have to calculate what your interests are. So it's hugely freeing, yeah.
The other thing, and I keep going back to the economics, because if it will succeed, it has to produce value. And if you look at the music industry, it is the perfect example, because you're disintermediating the companies who account for most of the cost. So the key answer is, how many somebody else's, to use Eric's expression, do you have to sell something to be viable? And what has happened in music is that the minimum efficient scale, to use an economic concept, has collapsed. You don't have to be a humongous blockbuster company that sells 250 or 300,000 CDs to make a living. You can make a living with 20,000 pals in MySpace. You don't have to be a Microsoft, which gives us one, new operating system every 6 years and ends up copying all of the advances that were made by other people in the intervening years. You release often, you constantly upgrade, you have a completely different model, so that we can have many more artists who sell to many more people, but in smaller groups. And they can make a living because they've squeezed out all the intermediary costs. So the key becomes this reduction in the minimum efficient scale, the democratization of the production of culture.
I mean, the one thing I would say about that is that I think that, and this gets a little bit back to this question about sort of user, receptions theory, is that because of the world we grew up in, our ideas about media are really, I think, have historically been this very top-down model, big television big music, whatever it is. And it is the one to many. But my suspicion has always been that even in that world, you had people who were either, even as they were watching, were sort of reimagining, right, what they were watching and thinking of how it might have been different or what they would do instead or whatever. But also we know there were, hobbyism. There was just a huge range of production that people were doing that never really surfaced. And I think what you now have with the tools that have become available is just that all that stuff is just becoming much more public. And again, this is what, the fact that people are willing to spend lots of time doing this and willing to spend lots of time creating things for no obvious economic benefit, even though the economic benefits have actually improved, it I think comes as a revelation to traditional economics, even though I think for most of us it's probably just like, well, duh, yeah, that's what people like to do, basically.
So I want to quarrel with that just slightly. People have always done things for all kinds of reasons, and we've always, most of us, economists actually believe that people like to have fun. They don't believe that economists like to have fun, but they believe they believe that people do. What we're at the edge of now is actually relying on that for the innovation and production that drive the society. That is new. Right. We didn't have any idea how that might be. We still don't completely understand how it's going to be, but there are big, important traces that it really might be, and I think that's the news.
That's right. That's right.
So
that was easy.
Before we break for coffee, please join me in giving a huge hand for it.
So now you know what I do.
Yes, I know. I'm delighted with it. This is how we keep on meeting.
Yes.